Working with your parts can feel like an uphill battle. Journaling, talking to parts, following trailheads, it can be downright exhausting. Center, the app, is here to help. Center supports IFS practicing individuals worldwide who want to deepen their connection with their inner system and access more self-energy. It simplifies the journey of inner exploration with intuitive tools to foster relationships with your parts and access more self. With guided meditations from leading IFS voices and a supportive community of like-minded explorers. Download Center, the IFS companion app built by a small team driven by a big shared why that everyone deserves to thrive. Get Center for iOS or Android and start your journey to greater self-leadership today. Welcome to Season 6 of the One Inside an Internal Family Systems podcast. I'm Tammy Sallenberger, author of The One Inside, 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. This podcast is for anyone curious about their inner world and who have a desire to connect to that authentic self. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Hey everyone, I am super excited to bring this unique conversation with superstar Dan Siegel. Dan's new book, Personality and Wholeness in Therapy, Integrating 9 Patterns of Developmental Pathways in Clinical Practice, is out. If you've been around for a while, you might recognize the idea of 9 patterns as the 9 types of the Enneagram. So this work is an evolutionary leap forward for the Enneagrams. We're so excited this is out in the world and that we get to talk to Dan about it. The conversation is deep, and if you are intrigued, sign on for Joan Ryan and I. We're going to do a 3-session intro class. If you're listening to this live, it's 2025 in January. So we're going to do an intro class, 3-session to talk about this podcast and the material that we talk about in the podcast. If it's not real time, just check out our latest offerings. We do a lot of IFS and Enneagram classes. Joan is also going to do a 6-week class on this material alone. So if you're interested in Joan's class, check out her website. And I just really hope you enjoy. Well, I am super excited today to have my friend Joan Ryan and Dan Siegel, who's written 20. How many books have you written, Dan? 21? We were just discussing this.
I think it's something like that. I have to count them, but I think this is the 21st one.
So Dan just came out with a book that Joan and I are super excited about. But before we start there, why don't we start where we always start, and I'll have you do this first. Can you tell everybody where you are in the world and what you see when you look out your nearest window?
So I am right outside of Boston. Unfortunately, it's dark outside, so I can't see much. But if I could see, I would be looking at the Charles River. And the rowing teams have been out, despite the fact that it's 29 degrees here today.
And what about you, Dan? Where are you in the world, and what do you see if you were to look out your nearest window?
Well, and Tammy, where are you, and where do you see?
Yeah, so I am in New Hampshire, and it is definitely chilly today. It's dark, but if I was to look out my window, that window right there, I would see the river. And I live on a river, and it's beautiful right now because there's no leaves on the trees, and there's no snow on the ground yet, but I can see the river really clearly. It's quite beautiful.
So great to be back with New England people. I'm actually in Southern California, so it's still light out here, so I won't go down for a couple of hours. And I look out at some trees, a little meditating statue figure, some wind chimes that I have on the tree branches, so I can look and sort of look out to go beyond this room. This is the room that my home office, where I've written every one of those books began and ended in this room. So it's a little teeny closet. My wife thinks it's kind of a funny little space, but I love this little corner of the world right here. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. And so, Joan, why don't we start with you telling us how you and Dan are connected and about this incredible book?
In 2003 or 2004, which was when this project started, I was the program manager for the Narrative Enneagram School in California. One session, which we did a week at a time, near Palo Alto, this guy showed up and they said he was Dr. Dan Siegel, and I didn't know. And there were other scientists, and all of a sudden there was this little group, and they were all meeting and interviewing us. And 20 years later, the book emerged. So I'm in the team Tammy and I have. She's the IFS expert, although I'm IFS trained, and I'm kind of the Enneagram expert. And my connection to Dan is that in the last stages of this book, I had the pleasure of working with him and then teaching with him in Canada, which was incredible fun in August. So, Dan, you want to tell the story of where the book came from in abbreviated form?
Yeah, well, tell me, thank you, Joan. First of all, it's great to see you again, and Tammy, nice to meet you. Tell me what's the most useful for you and your listeners in the community, because there's so much to say, and I
Okay.
have so much excitement and enthusiasm for this project, being out in the world, and so rather, I mean, I can do that, Joan, but I'll probably go off too long. So let me do what's most useful for everybody.
So the way probably to frame it is what Tammy and I do together is we use IFS methods and theory, but methods specifically with our clients and students to help them explore their patterns in the Enneagram. Sometimes we have people who know their Enneagram pattern. A lot of times we have people that don't. But by putting the two things together, we think that we can help people go much more deeply into their own personal work. And that's been our experience for the last 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would love to hear, I think two things I would love to hear. I've been really fascinated by the agency bonding and certainty material. And I'd love for you to talk about the patterns that you're seeing with that. Because what we've discovered is, so I'm a type, so before we have this book, we would say I'm a type 3. So Dan, would you say I'm a type 3, or what would you say? Like I have a 3 pattern?
Yeah, we don't use the numbers anymore.
Okay.
So there's a couple ways of going. In the book, at this moment in the book, you know, you would say I lead with rather than I am. And we're looking at these patterns as more verb-like processes of tendencies rather than a noun-like entity that you are. So that's why the change in the wording is helpful. And we can talk about why that's the case. So we would say that you lead with the bonding vector, and that your tendency, the primary orientation of your attention, is both this kind of shimmering between inward and outward that we call dyadic. So you would be in the leading with the pattern that we would designate as bonding dyadic.
Okay. So
And you would abbreviate that with a capital B for bonding and a little d for dyadic.
Okay, so for people that don't know, there was 9 types of the Enneagram, and so agency bonding and certainty, and then so I'm bonding, which is 3, and then I have attention outward and inward, and that's one way of, so explain to people, so people's attention is either going to be inward or outward or both.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that we think the majority of people lean into some of those, but they lead with one of those primarily. Ultimately, we can probably access to some degree, maybe not initially, each of these 9 patterns. That's our proposal. But you lead with, and may your whole life lead with that, because it's a part of what we call temperament. So,
Perfect.
yeah, temperament is distinct from personality, but we can get into that. And also, when you think about, and full disclosure, I'm friends with Dick Schwartz. So he and I have a lot of personal conversations between interpersonal neurobiology, the field I work in, and IFS, internal family systems. And we even did a whole 2 days when we were first getting to know each other. We've become good friends since then. But you'll see if you watch Dick sells that 2-day conference, which you can purchase from Dick from his website. But the fascinating thing about that was you'll see certain contrasts and certain overlaps of our 2 ways of approaching the mind.
And looking at it through my eyes, I lead with the agency dyadic pattern, which in Enneagram terms is 9. And I'm aware, I think, that all three of us have dyadic tendencies in this
Yeah.
conversation. The idea of dyadic tendency is an innovation in Enneagram circles. And what I know from my narrative experience is that it far better describes my attention and actually Tammy's attention than what we used to say, which was that we were outer focused. But when I look into myself, I can see that back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But without this frame from the book, I don't think I ever would have known that. So it's a
Well,
really big change.
the like 90-second summary of what happened after the meeting that Joan's describing is, David Daniels, who is a leader in the field of Enneagram teaching and thinking and a writer in that area, he was a part of this 5-person group that assembled there at the meeting Joan is referring to back in January of 2004. So it was over 20 years ago now. And, when we gathered together, I was invited there to be a scientist, just, basically interviewing people and trying to think deeply about what the science beneath the Enneagram would be, because Enneagram had so much wisdom to teach uh, in these 9 core patterns, and also, some other variations that we can get into. But there was no science behind it. It was kind of more descriptive. And David had collected tens of thousands, actually almost 50,000 orally acquired, spoken word narratives. So our job was to try to figure out, is there a science beneath why people were telling the stories they were telling? And I was trained as a narrative scientist through the National Institute of Mental Health. And my 3 other colleagues besides David are Denise Daniels, David's daughter, who got her PhD in genetics of personality and temperament, her close friend Laura Baker, who's a professor of the genetics of personality and temperament, and Jack Killen, who at the time was the deputy medical director of the Division of Alternative Medicine for the National Institutes of Health. So, these are pretty robust scientists with their training. And I, come from a field of studying different things in interpersonal neurobiology. So we thought we'd apply the IPNB, or interpersonal neurobiology lens, to understanding the Enneagram. And what ended up happening, which was kind of a surprise, was it was an exploration maybe of some more universal aspect of humanity. That is, what is temperament in adults? We know a little bit about it in kids. How does it persist into adults? And how does that temperament then shape what we call personality? And then how does your attachment set of experiences, your relationship with your caregivers, shape all that? And then, because the mind is multi-layered, and Dick and I would disagree with this part, but, it has many facets to it that I call states of mind, and Dick calls them parts or people inside you. So we have a difference in that, and I love Dick dearly, but we just disagree. And so I'll just give you my perspective on the IFS part of this, is that, these states of mind are, these organizational features that in our framework, we call them plateaus of the way energy moves through us. And they can shape our state of mind in a given moment. And when they persist across time and context, we call that personality. So the thing I was fascinated with as a clinician is, how, because I was working with people with trauma who had dissociative disorders, how did temperament express itself differently across different dissociative states in people with, let's say, DID? And so I, for whatever reason, became like the local expert in DID, and so I had lots of patients with DID. So I learned to become a therapist through the lens of literally parts of a person that were these states of mind that were fragmented because it was the only way they could survive. One of my patients is just finishing a book now, Sally Maslansky, on what it was like to have DID and go through therapy. And now she's a therapist, so she's now a colleague, not my patient. But you'll read in her book, the stages of the work to work with DID, which is overlaps in some ways, but in other ways is quite distinct from the kind of approach of IFS. So we have something called state integration in interpersonal neurobiology. There are 9 domains of integration. One of them is state integration. And that's probably the beginning of what overlaps with IFS. So the issue is, on one extreme, you could say that every part from an IFS point of view is an expression through the lens of someone's given temperament. So then you would see that whatever part you are, it's somehow manifesting this particular combination of a vector, A, B, or C, agency, bonding, certainty is what we came up with when we did this analysis, and inward, outward, or dyadic a tendency. Or you could say, well, no, you have different parts totally can inhabit any of the nine. And then you might have a really fascinating research question. So when I was teaching in London recently, I was actually living in a house with Dick Schwartz and Bessel van der Kolk. So they came to my public talk, and both of them thought that this PDP approach, is what we call it, patterns of developmental pathways, could illuminate how there are 9 ways, in Bessel's terms, that we would actually adapt to trauma. And in Dick's view, there were 9 ways to really understand how protective parts may be manifesting themselves differently with different emphases, and how exiles might be experiencing different things based on their particular states of mind. And so Dick and Bessel were both excited about how to apply the PDP, in Bessel's case, to trauma in general, and in Dick's case, to IFS. So I don't think they're contradictory. It's an open question. How do different parts in parts work express temperament in distinct ways or actually common ways? It's a really fascinating question. And, now that the book is out, people can use their clinical wisdom and clinical experience to really ask that question. So it's open. It's an open issue.
And it really fits with some of what Tammy and I have been doing over the last few years, because what we're finding is in IFS language, there are clusters of protector parts that play out the pattern in people who identify with that pattern. And we can find them. What I've been saying for a long time is I think they have to be there because they hold the structure of the pattern together. So there's specific areas. But what's so exciting about this is it opens it up to what we're also seeing, which is the way that it expresses can be extremely different. It's just that it's coming from the same root, the same motivation, the same attention. And
Yeah, well, I'm loving that that we all, so like I'm bonding, Joan is agency, and Dan, you're certainty, which works
Yes.
perfectly for your job and your life. And so what we've talked about, what Joan and I have talked about, and I really love playing with this idea, and I'm curious what you think about this, Dan, is so if I'm bonding, then what I've found is that I have so many of my parts, so use my IFS language, work really hard to make sure I have bonding. That's part of my managers. They work very hard to make sure bonding and connection happen. And when bonding and connection is broken, my firefighters come in because it's intolerable to me. So that's how I'm understanding, and Joan and I are understanding this material like in a really simple way of the agency, bonding, and certainty, and how parts are around it. So I'm curious what you think about that, and if there's anything you would want to add to that kind of idea, or how you would
Yeah.
use it in your language.
Yeah, no, I love that. I would say it exactly like that, Tammy. And what's so exciting to hear that, and we've been working this for 20 years. We did publish an initial, thing in a book I wrote called The Mindful Therapist, and a paper that Jack put out back in 2009, 2010. And so, but few people kind of picked it up, and so this is exciting that it's now in a very elaborated form, in this book, that took 6 years to write.
Should we all hold it up?
Here it is. Yeah. So it's super exciting. Yeah, I would say just like you're saying it, and I think the notion that it's a simple way of saying it is exactly what we were hoping for, because we spent years as scientists trying to decode these narratives and tried out this model, that model, this model, and got rid of them. For example, there are 9 domains of integration in interpersonal neurobiology. So we thought, oh, that's cool. And there are 9 Enneagram, patterns. So they probably match. Well, they don't. So it would have been so easy to say it's this or that, or there are 9 aspects of temperament, and they don't exactly match in the standard world. So we got rid of that stuff. So when we finally landed on these networks beneath the cortex, so when there's something beneath, we call it sub. So the term subcortical sounds fancy, but it just means it's below the higher part of the brain. And that's a good place to look for temperament, because the subcortical areas, the brainstem and the limbic areas, they form pretty much in utero. So you're born with them. So you hear the phrase that temperament are the inborn, meaning they're not learned, inborn tendencies of the nervous system, like what you're sensitive to, or what you react to in a big way, or when the things you expect aren't there, what triggers you, that kind of stuff. So that's all temperament. So let's say the 3 of us. So for Joan with the A, and I named them this way, ABC, so people would remember them. The way they're talked about in literature is not like this. I had to translate this myself as a person who writes a lot, compared to, the words that are used. This is really about a motivational set of circuits that are beneath the cortex and also involve the cortex. But the subcortical part of it is about anger when embodied empowerment is thwarted. So when you want to get your bodily needs met, you get frustrated, you get irritated, you get angry, and when it's extreme, you get rageful. So we just call that anger, and Jaak Panksepp's work looks at this anger network. Well, it's a part of a larger system that I just named a vector, meaning a directionality that's about your motivation. And what's absolutely fascinating about this is we came up with this model back in, we published it in 2009, 2010. In 2017, Carol Dweck independently did an analysis. She's a professor of psychology at Stanford. She isn't in the personality area, but it's something she loved and was interested in. So she reviewed all the existing academic literature having nothing to do with the Enneagram, and she came up with the same 3 fundamental motivations she calls what we call agency. And I Zoomed with her and can tell you she agrees completely. Her model matches ours like 100%. It's absolutely amazing. So an example of consilience. So she calls the agency, what we call agency, she calls competence. So you feel a sense of competence and empowerment. What we also looked at is what we call the B, the bonding network, is actually a network that has beneath the cortex is the emotion of separation, distress, and sadness, because it's about your connection, your relational connections. And so the motivation is for bonding. She calls it a motivation for acceptance, which is the same as bonding, basically. And then we were going to call it predictability, but I said that you can't remember that. ABP, that doesn't make sense. Let's call it certainty. And hers is predictability. So she says, even in in the chapter that was derived from her paper in 2022, in this huge textbook, Joan saw me carry it, even though I had to fly on a seaplane, 4.5 pound thing. Well, I finally read that thing in Oxford after we were together, Joan, and I came across this article. It just blew my mind, because independently, what this means is that Carol Dweck, one of our most esteemed and respected, I guess those are redundant, one of our most respected professors of psychology, researchers in psychology, independent of the Enneagram and independent of the PDP view, came up with a model that is virtually identical to the model we proposed. And she even has a sentence which addressed as a certainty person, my nerve-wracking thing was not only proposing the tendency thing, which she doesn't talk about, which was shown in another paper by a colleague of mine in the brain, Mary Helen Imordino Yang's work, but that's another story. But for this finding, I was worried that everyone would just say, oh, and it would be enough of a contribution to say, we think we've come up with something to explain the Enneagram. But when I was talking to my colleagues in the field of mental health, they didn't have a model of personality. So I thought, okay, well, this will be a fun thing, contribute a model of the Enneagram, a science of the Enneagram. But when Carol Dweck came out with her paper, and I just read it, a couple months ago after the book was already in the warehouses, so you won't see it in the book, I realized that this then was not just a model of the Enneagram. looked like it was consistent with, according to Carol Dweck, the entire field of 70 years of searching for personality patterns, not determining there is no such thing as a type, like a fixed thing, like a noun, but more like a collection of variables that have various degrees of intensity. And that's consistent with how we see temperament. So that it looks like this PDP model, this patterns of developmental pathway model of ABC, and then if you go along agency bonding, and the certainty one is basically the subcortical network about fear, with the feeling of, this, when it's mild, of anxiety, but when it's intense, it could be terror. And that's activated when your drive for certainty is thwarted. You want to be able to predict to protect, basically. So it's about safety. So, for example, when I write a book, my deep motivation to write all these books is to try to get some kind of certainty, if I can, in some way, explore the nature of reality, and if I could articulate it in some approximation of what's close to true, I feel really good. And I'll read the book over and over and over again. I'll say, I've researched it, I've done my planning, I've questioned everything. This book is the way this book needs to be. And if no one reads it and it doesn't sell very well, I go, oh well, I'm very proud of this book. If I have a friend who lives more in another area, let's say the bonding dyadic, and when he writes a book, he watches how many sell. And if they don't sell well, he's crushed. And he'll check in with me. He goes, how's your book doing? And I go, I have no idea. He goes, well, look it up, look it up. I go, why? All I was trying to do was express myself. If no one wants to read it, that's their problem. And it's a completely different emotional experience. So I can keep on writing these books because I'm not doing it to get anybody's approval. I'm just writing it to try to articulate what I hope will be helpful. And of course, it's meaningful, deeply meaningful when someone says, this is really useful, like this conversation we're having here. But I didn't do it to get someone's approval that I'm an okay person.
Okay,
like my friend.
so let's back up though, and then talk about this idea of the outward and inward, or both, and sort of teach people what that is, because that's been really interesting. And I've even noticed that in my parts work, and Dan, I don't know that you agree with this, but I've noticed it with the little people running around in my head, that's sort of part of. Anyway, it's just been very interesting noticing that it's not like they just need the sort of inner knowing; they need the inner knowing and the external person validation. Like, it's my parts are needing both experiences. So let's back up. Tell me what a tendency means. And this outward, inward, and both.
Yeah. So we were, trying to review all these narratives, and we just noticed that one of the features of the way people talk about their lives, just like you're doing now, Tammy, whether it's about through the lens of the word part, or just, one aspect of me or one facet of me looks inward, one looks outward, and kind of, or it's in this tension between the two. So it isn't just an addition of, oh, I'm inward and I'm outward. It's kind of this tension that arises. That's why we use the word dyadic, not just like combined or something like that. So here's what we noticed. We noticed that and I'll give you the formal long term we used initially, the primary orientation of energy and attention. So attention is that process that directs energy and information flow. And it was almost like, where's a person's energy? Is it in front of their face, or is it inside their head, or is it kind of this weird blah, 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 tension of shimmering, toggling inward, outward, like that? And we just noticed that. We said, well, that's kind of weird. And we couldn't find anything in the literature. And at a birthday party, when I was finishing I'm the primary writer, finishing the final writing for the book, I was in Vancouver, and a friend of mine took me out for my birthday. And she goes, how's it going? I said, I'm so questioning this book because I'm so doubting it, because we made this weird proposal. The ABC stuff, we have a lot of data for that, and it fits with Jock Paintsep work. But this instead of primary orientation of attentional focus, I was so tired of typing that. I said, there's got to be either an acronym or a short word. So I said, if it's the tendency of attention, and you got that tendency of attention, let's call it a tendency. So I made up that word. So that's because I didn't want to type primary orientation of attentional focus over and over and over again. So a tendency is a made-up word, but that's what it means. So I said to her, I said, I'm so nervous about it. She goes, well, what are you talking about? And I explained it to her what inward, outward, dyadic is. And she said, don't you realize 10 years ago, I did a study of a wide group of people. And in the brain, I noticed some were inward, some were outward, and some this weird shimmering between inward and outward. And she shows me the paper right there at the dinner, the lunch, the birthday lunch. And I just said, this is the best birthday present for a doubting person like myself, I could ever have, because I mean, we came up with it independently. So another example of consilience. So that's what we think happens. We think it's our proposal. It could be wrong. The whole thing could be wrong. But, of course, I'm going to say that. The proposal is that it's an aspect of temperament. So one of the things about the Enneagram that David would write about initially, and I disagreed with, because I'm an attachment researcher, is he would say, and I think a lot of Enneagram teachers would say, that you get your Enneagram type as an adaptation to your experiences. So one of the big differences that the PDP model has is we believe the sensitivity of your motivational vector and your attentional focus, the tendency, is a temperament feature not determined by your attachment. But if your attachment is not secure, it will make those two things more intensely entrapping your life in a kind of prison of chaos and rigidity, because the system will be not so integrated. And when you're not integrated, you get chaotic or rigid, or both. And that's an example of what we mean by a personality being a prison. But when you do the work you need to do, whether it's parts work or trauma work or PDP work or whatever you want to call the work, when you become more integrated, even developing more secure attachment, you move yourself toward a playground of personality. So you may always have that combo of the vector A or B or C and the tendency inward, dyadic or outward. And that combination matches completely with the 9 Enneagram core types, in types using the word that the Enneagram often uses, but we see them as patterns. And then what you say is that therapy is not to get rid of which of those 9 may be what you lead with, but allowing yourself to reach the higher integrated states of that given combo. So for me, for example, I would call it a questioning pattern, this certainty, drive for certainty, and inward and outward can drive you nuts if it's a prison. But if I can liberate itself, then I find it useful to write books, because I'm always questioning things that are said, and I go, well, I don't know if that's true. Like the first big one was people said the mind is just the brain. I said, I don't know if that's true. But people have been saying for 2,500 years. I said, I don't really care. It might not be true. It might actually not be true. And so, for 30 years, I've been working with the field of mental health to have them not say mind is a synonym for brain activity, that it's much bigger. Yeah.
So, Dan, one of the things that people say is, so in Enneagram words, so in Enneagram words, language, Dan is a type 6. And so you're not saying that you would move types with health or attachment or therapy. You wouldn't move patterns. Like you would still be a certainty pattern.
Certainly dyadic.
Dyadic pattern.
That's a testable and excellent question. And what we would say are clinical observations from David and from me, workshop observations from Denise, Laura, and Jack, are that as people move from lower, vulnerable, less integrated ways that the pattern is experiencing itself in a person's life, you move to higher integrated states. Now, what a higher integrated states means, I can look at the strengths of questioning, or you can look at the strengths of producing, Tammy, or Joan, you could look at the strengths of harmonizing, right? These are kind of broad terms we don't use in the book, but I've come to use them since the book has been out. And so then what's a higher functioning for me of the questioning is to have fun with the questioning. And if I start questioning this or that and it's driving me nuts, I can laugh at myself. And even my friends and my wife can laugh with me at myself. So that's where it's fun. I go, well, I'm always going to do that. On the other hand, You know, if we go for a hike and it's great weather and I question whether the weather's going to be great and I do my worst case scenario thinking and I'm going with 5 family members, so I take a jacket for myself and 5 extra jackets in the trunk. And then we get there and the weather has turned and no one has a jacket. So people turn to me and they go, Dad or Dan, do you have anything for us? I said, of course I do. And everyone gets a jacket. No one else thought to do that. And so then I have fun with that. I didn't get plagued by it and say, let's not go. It could be bad weather. So that's, so I may always be that way. And this is not a but, and I may always lead with that. But then we would use the phrase, I can lean into higher levels of any of the other 8 combinations. And there are these things that I call bridging patterns, which would be, just like you said, the 3 of us have a bridging pattern that we're all dyadic. There's also the bridging pattern of everybody in my vector, which classically in the Enneagram world would be called, the 5, one that's doing all this planning, or the 7 that's, busy seeking all this excitement. They're all in the same vector, the certainty vector. So I can absolutely lean to the higher side of the planning one. And when I'm getting ready to write a book, I can go to, and that's by my inward tendency. I can move my tendency from dyadic to outward, and I can look very much like, quote, a 7. We don't use those terms anymore, but the certainty outward. And now I'm seeking all these fun things to do with this PDP model. But I can also go up my stuff, and I can become absolutely a producing pattern. I can become a harmonizing lead with that. I start leaning into that. And then there's also another thing that's really fun, which I don't know if we have time to get into it, but we noticed that there's research proven 3 ways that we regulate emotion. One is to upregulate it, a second is to downregulate it, and a third is to shift out of it altogether. And what we noticed is that in the trio within each vector is a distribution of each of those emotion regulation patterns. I call them modes or means of deploying emotion. So I can go from I'm an experience and express regulator. If I want to stay in that, I can go way over on purpose, holding on to that experience and express thing. And I can look just like a 4 on the Enneagram, which you might go, where's the bridge there? Well, the bridge there is my emotion regulation mode. Because those of us who are in, the certainty dyadic, known as an Enneagram 6, are big time experiencing and expressing things. Well, sometimes I want to do that with my emotions of love and connection with other people and with nature. And then I can even sometimes, and hopefully it's on the higher side of that, on the that's the bonding inward, I can actually go over to the agency outward, which in Enneagram terms would be the 8. And I can be very directing, that directing pattern, and hopefully on the higher side of it, where I'm very compassionate and caring. So I'm not bossing people around, but I'm trying to inspire people. So I can bounce around to all these, what I call them bridging patterns. And those bridging patterns explain 88% of what the Enneagram talks about as lines and connection and all that stuff. And
Wings, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so the three emotion, it's reframe. So the 3, name the 3 emotional.
So upregulate, if you think about an arrow going up, is EE, experience and express. So you really feel the motivation and the emotion in a big way, which of course can drive you nuts if you're in the lower side of the pattern. So it's not always great to experience and express it. But if I'm in the upside, I can say, I'm questioning, is there a science of the Enneagram? And is it what David says? And he's my dear friend, David Daniels, and I can push against him in a fun way. And then Carol Dweck can come out with her thing that's identical to ours because we stayed true to the science. We didn't stick to what the lore was in the Enneagram world. So that would be an example of, okay, I was experiencing and expressing the doubt and the motivation for certainty. So that's one. The second one is downregulate. So this would be where you're reframing it. No, where you're containing it and channeling it. So you're staying, let's talk about, well, actually the 3 of us have the 3 different emotion regulation modes. For you, Tammy, for the bonding dyadic, what we noticed is it's this down regulate, which is contain and channel. So you would contain the emotion of a drive for relational connection, channel it into producing stuff in the world, hold on to your nervousness. Are people going to like this podcast? Are they going to like a book? Are they going to like what you do? Are they going to like how you speak? You contain it and channel it, but you're still with the relational connection emotion, and that's what it's about. Does that resonate with you?
Definitely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're able to contain and channel it. The third one, if we turn to Joan, in a not integrated state can become really challenging because you're shifting. And you're reframing the whole drive. This is for agency and then reframing it and redirecting. So RR, the other one was CC. So these are the terms we made up, but the basic thing of shifting is the research proven stuff in general, not in terms of the Enneagram. So what we notice is that if you're in a harmonizing pattern, what I would call that, the classic Enneagram 9, and Joan, you can speak to this, then what's your basic emotion regulation mode, your means of deploying emotion, MODE, this mode tends to be shift. So when you weren't more integrated, Joan, and someone would say to you, hey, where do you want to go to dinner? What would you say?
Doesn't matter, wherever you want to go.
Yeah.
In Enneagram terms, very often you get people who lead with a 9 pattern, lead with an agency dyadic pattern, who say anger has nothing to do with me, and this is the reason. And all the way along, people will always say, again, in Enneagram terms, 2 or 3, and I've heard it said to Tammy, well, how can you be an emotional type? It's because it's contained and channeled, or how can you be? And it's explaining pieces that we've seen in the narratives over and over and over again, backed by the science, which makes enormous amounts of difference.
Joan, that's so helpful to hear. And it's why, and Joan was there when we figured it out. I tried over the summer I had 5 interns work with me. And we said, let's take this approach. Let's condense it into a Likert scale set of statements like, tend to be like this, tend to be like that. And let's do an analysis with hundreds and hundreds of people so that people could, have an easy questionnaire, that people find so popular to take and get a number that gives you some kind of certainty. And what we found was 50% of the time it was really accurate, and 50% of the time it completely failed, which means it's totally useless.
So Dan's talking about Enneagram tests right now.
Well, no, I'm talking about a PDP test.
Okay.
We actually made our own.
Okay, even your own test.
Even the own test.
Oh, yeah. I was going bananas, and why is he doing this? And I don't understand until I figured out that we were going to disprove.
Well, we were going to see if it worked, and we proved that it doesn't work. And in fact, not only does it not work, but when people get the false impression that, I got somebody's questionnaire or Dan's questionnaire or whatever, and this was the number I got, now I've got to become a good that. When 50% of the time it's totally wrong.
It's awful. Well, and I can say, Dan, that in 30 years of being an Enneagram teacher, this has been part of the bane of my existence, is these people who say, but I took 4 different tests and they all say this, and I'm looking at the pattern and it's not there.
Yeah.
But people get locked.
So we invite, in the approach, basically you might say, well, then how can you do this? Well, we invite a deeper opening, almost like cleaning a lens of your attention so that you can see some things that otherwise may have been a little murky. For example, this is a model based on motivation that helps you see, are you ABC as your primary motivation? Well, for those that are in the shifting mode, they may not be very aware of their motivation for sure, right? And so that's a third of the group right there that's going to go, whoa, that didn't quite work. And then with the attendancy thing, your energy is where it is. You grew up with that being the way it is. So it's hard for someone to just give you a few sentences and say, here, do a Likert scale, a lot, not so much, not at all. It's really hard. But if you sit with this for a few hours, and we're hoping the book will do that for the reader, or in workshops, over a few days. And after I was with Joan, we did a 3-day and a 4-day. I was with people for a whole day, and I've gotten great results, incredible results, even spending a day. But people, rather than just give a simple set of statements, you can really go on a journey. And the journey, we haven't talked about it here, but I'll just say this, and I was so excited to see Carol Dweck came up with the same proposal. You start with an experience of wholeness, whether that's in the Big Bang, or whether it's just the universe of where consciousness comes from. And I write this up in a book called Intraconnected, or the book Aware. Or you just think about implicit memory, a form of memory we begin with in the womb. Then you have something called effortless being. And our proposal is that when you go from the state of effortless being, no matter how much stress your mom may have been in when she was carrying you, you still have this fact that you don't have to eat, you don't have to sleep, you don't have to do anything particularly, you don't have to do anything, you're just being. And we call that effortless being this state of wholeness that may match with Carol Dweck's notion of coherence. Anyway, you begin with this wholeness, and then you depart from it, because after you're born, everything is different. So our hypothesis is that temperament, your ABC, your sensitivity of agency or bonding or certainty, maybe some people have all three, and that's a researchable question, but majority of people seem to lean into one of those, lead with one of those anyway. And your attendancy, whether it's inward energy, outward energy, or dyadic, in terms of it being a shimmering of those two, those will determine how you respond to this working for a living. Basically, it's do or die. If you don't breathe, you die. If you don't have connections with other people, you die. If you don't have predictability in your environment, you die. So it's a do or die situation. I don't want to scare anyone, but for the rest of your life. So what we think happens is your temperament acts like a filter for how this initiation of the do or die situation will activate, and you're going to now have an adaptive strategy that is responding to your own temperament. So in Carol Dweck's terms, I think this matches what she calls BEATS, which I love her acronym. It's beliefs that emerge, emotions, and action tendencies, BEAT. That's from Carol Dweck. And it's exactly what we mean by adaptive strategy. So you develop these BEATS, these adaptive strategies, to being out here in the world. And if you carry that forward till the day you die, the personality serves as a filter, and in a way, who you really are, your home base, is wholeness. But personality is kind of just a filter that keeps you, at times, from experiencing that wholeness, and it's how you try to get back to wholeness. So I made sure in the writing of the book not to say that your personality pattern was your home base, but call it your baseline. Because when people do the deep work, in a way, they get beneath personality to this realization that I have this wholeness where this body called Dan, the body called Tammy, the body called Joan, are all the same essence that is just an expression of vast possibility arising into actuality. And you start to feel that. And personality just is your way of dealing with the fact that you live in a body. So I think as long as someone's in a body, their temperament will be expressing how you filter this working for a living situation. And it's all a journey, a lifelong journey, back to, and if you don't like the back to part, just say to wholeness.
I love that we're ending with this idea of wholeness. In your conversations with Dick, do you think that Dick would say that's the same as self? Like self-energy and the wholeness? Okay.
Exactly, Tammy. When he and I did our 2-day together, I call it the hub of this wheel of awareness practice we do, which correlates with what a mechanism I've proposed called the plane of possibility. And I think that's exactly what it is. And I think Dick would agree.
Well, and it's one of the things that's come up in bringing IFS and the Enneagram together is that people, again, try to force it into a model and say, well, certain characteristics or qualities of what Dick would call self inure to certain patterns. And it doesn't work that way because we are all going for wholeness. And anybody in any pattern could go to any of those categories. And this supports that idea. And I like the breadth of it and the openness of it and the growingness of it.
Yeah, it is a lifelong growing experience, Joan. I think that's absolutely right. And Tammy, you're pointing out a beautiful, consilience. So I can, present to Dick like I did this in England this summer, and he can get excited about it and see the overlaps. I can present to Bessel van der Kolk, and he gets excited. Joan and I can, work together looking at this through the Enneagram lens. We can look at it through the IFS lens. You know, what's exciting about it too is it gives all of us, mental health professionals, coaches, anyone, an opportunity to say, what is personality made of? What is the journey to wholeness, to health, to flourishing life? And it gives you a pathway, whatever your particular strategy of therapy is. This model of the patterns of developmental pathways can be applied, and I hope will be of use to many people.
Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Joan, do you want to say anything before we head out?
I'm just really grateful. I love talking to you. You know that. And we're going to continue experimenting with it. I think PDP is an enormous advance to what we're doing with our students and our clients, and just continue to be grateful.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the last question that I always ask everyone. Joan, I'll ask you first, and then Dan, I'll ask you. If you had to do something different in your life, different than you're doing now, what would you do? Something playful. You could pick anything you wanted to do. What would you do instead?
Well, I'm in this space where I have this 6-month-old grandson who is way fun. So I think I would be spending a lot more time doing that than working.
Yeah. What about you, Dan?
I'd probably give myself more permission and make more opportunities to have music and dance in my life. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, thank you both so much. I have lots more questions and just lots of curiosity. So thank you so much. Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you left a rating, a review, a like, comment, share with your family, your friends. That would mean so much to me. My book is available at your favorite independent bookstore or on Amazon. You can visit my website, tammysalenberger.com, or you can download a free Get to Know a Should part of you. You can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram and at The One Inside on Facebook and on YouTube. Jeff Schrum co-produces The One Inside, and I am forever grateful for Jeff. Also thankful for Jack Reardon for creating the music, and just thank you for listening. 6 seasons, over 1 million downloads. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you in this community. I'll see you next time.